So we understand that intensity and rep numbers are interdependent, and we have some good ranges for the combination to serve different purposes. Now we need to decide how to prescribe intensity. We have a number of options. We can prescribe absolute intensity by giving the lifter an actual weight in kilos, relative intensity with a percentage of 1 rep max, or we can use a few subjective methods. The first of those is simple descriptions like light, easy, or moderate. This can be appropriate for accessory work that doesn't really need quantified intensity, although it's definitely vague and not all athletes will do a good job choosing appropriate weights. Better are systems like RPE or RIR. These are still subjective, based on an athlete's self-evaluation of effort, but they're quantified in a sense so we can at least communicate the intention for effort more effectively. Percentage prescriptions are the most common approach for good reason. They're objective, so there's no having to rely on an athlete to make good decisions, which is often a risky proposal, and they give us a decent representation of effort, so it's fairly easy to prescribe intensity for exercises or rep ranges an athlete hasn't done before. Percentages also usually conform well to a given athlete's typical effort. A percentage of a 1 rep max is basically a fraction of that athlete's hardest effort, meaning that whether they're the type of athlete who will risk death to complete a max single, or the type who look like they're still warming up during a max lift, percentages of that lift will reflect that same relative effort level. This means that we can adjust percentages a bit to address that if needed to effectively reduce or increase a lifter's effort level in their day-to-day training as we see fit. So with the athlete who's at death's door on every max lift, we can reduce the percentages we prescribe to keep them at a more effective effort level in training so they don't blow themselves out. And with athletes who tend to cruise a bit too much with max lifts, we can bump percentages up a bit to force them to put out more effort. Percentages will often also need to be adjusted for 2 other basic reasons. With strength work like squats, we need to consider neurological efficiency to some degree. This is basically how much of their true absolute strength potential an athlete can access voluntarily. Due primarily to the influence of testosterone, female athletes will generally have lower neurological efficiency than males, meaning their 1 rep maxes are somewhat less of that absolute potential, and this in turn means they will be typically capable of doing more reps at a given percentage than male athletes of similar training history. So we may need to bump percentages up a bit in strength work to reflect this and get the effort level we're looking for. Newer lifters will be similar in that due to low neurological efficiency from a lack of training, low technical proficiency, and often not yet really having learned how to train well, their efforts less accurately reflect their basic physical ability. This means that even basic strength work may need to use higher percentages than more experienced athletes, but primarily this is going to affect things like pulling variations that are prescribed as a percent of the associated competition lift. Because their competition lifts are limited by technical ability rather than strength and power, typical pull loading is going to be too light to have much if any real effect. Pull and deadlift loading will need to be prescribed somewhat independently of the snatch and clean based on the assessment of the athlete's ability in those lifts themselves. But again, it's important to keep in mind that these are broad generalizations and that a lot of other factors like training history can influence this. So while you may expect certain things to be true, ultimately you always need to be prescribing based on the individual rather than a demographic. Finally, we have subjective intensity methods like RPE and RIR. RPE stands for rate of perceived exertion. In other words, how hard the athlete feels they're working on a scale of 1 to 10. RIR stands for reps in reserve, meaning how many more reps in the set the athlete believes they could make with a true max effort. RPE is generally more suitable for Olympic weightlifting because we're normally dealing with low reps, so it's tough to be accurate with RIR because the scale doesn't leave much room. The trick with RPE is athletes learning how to self-evaluate accurately, which definitely takes experience. Something you can do as a coach is ask your athletes to write down what they think the RPE is on their top sets when prescribed in other ways to get them some practice and let you check how accurate you think they are. The primary benefit of these is that we can prescribe an intended level of effort without having to know all these details about a lifter that we need to use percentages as accurately as possible. In practice, RPE and RIR are arguably just as variable as percentages. The real difference is that we're shifting the choice of weight from the coach to the athlete. In other words, we're relying on the athlete to not only understand the intent of a given prescription, but also to be capable of accurately evaluating their level of effort, and this is notoriously problematic. You're going to get intensities that reflect a lifter's training tendencies, not just the desired effort level. Lifters who tend to not push as hard are going to overestimate their effort, which results in lower intensity. And lifters who tend to always push as hard as possible are going to underestimate their effort, which results in higher intensity. You'll get lifters failing partway through a set that's supposed to be 8 RPE. So while in theory it might be the optimal way to prescribe intensity for qualified athletes, there's a lot of potential for problems that need to be addressed as well as possible ahead of time. Newer lifters are good candidates for subjective intensity prescriptions because they don't have accurate 1-rep maxes to base percentages on in addition to the complications I talked about earlier. The problem is that they also don't have a well-developed ability to evaluate their own effort levels, if for no other reason than a lack of experience. So it's definitely a bit of a conundrum to wrestle with as a coach. You're left to decide what the most effective approach is for each athlete, and then do your best to educate them on what you're trying to accomplish so they're better able to contribute instead of derailing their own training with bad decisions. Ultimately, when using RPE or RIR, the coach needs to pay attention to how accurate the athlete's efforts appear to be relative to prescriptions, and then guide the athlete as needed to improve that accuracy.